Welcome back to the deep dive. We're jumping headfirst into the massive, intricate, and let's be honest, fiercely debated world of Elden Ring today. Specifically, we're looking at two recent, pretty significant releases that have really stirred the pot. There's this multiplayer-focused experience called Nightreign, and then the absolute behemoth Shadow of the Erdtree DLC.
Right, the big one.
Exactly. And you've shared just a stack of community discussions, reviews, wiki details, mainly pulled from places like Reddit and Fextralife.
And our mission here, with this deep dive is really to cut through all that noise. There are so many conflicting opinions, just a huge volume of information. We want to pull out the core insights.
Yeah, what are people actually saying?
What are players and reviewers really finding? What are the key takeaways, maybe the surprising details? And importantly, where's the real friction coming from?
Exactly, because there's a lot bubbling up from these sources. Nightreign feels, I don't know, maybe like an experimental side project, while Shadow of the Erdtree is clearly the highly anticipated main course. Okay, let's unpack this.
Let's do it.
So starting with Nightreign, the sources, they paint a picture of something ambitious, definitely, but maybe fundamentally challenged by its own design choices. It's heavily focused on multiplayer, which is, kind of a departure from software. But the community reception seems, well, complicated. What do you say? Complicated is definitely the word.
Yeah.
Looking through the sources, one of the biggest, most immediate barriers players ran into was simply the multiplayer requirement itself.
Right.
Several discussions highlighted like the absolute minimum of needing two other friends to really engage with it consistently.
I saw that everywhere. People talking about being adults, jobs, families.
Yep.
And how incredibly difficult it is to coordinate schedules.
With two specific friends, for the kind of dedicated sessions a game like this seems to require. One user specifically mentioned, like, they're lucky if they can get an hour of sync time with friends. And that's just not enough to make, meaningful progress in these Nightreign runs.
And it's not just any two friends, right? It has to be two friends who play video games.
Right.
And specifically are into the demanding style of Elden Ring or maybe Dark Souls. That really narrows the pool significantly for a lot of people.
Totally. And adding to that, the sources called out a surprising lack of, well, basic, almost expected modern multiplayer features.
Yeah, that was striking.
No crossplay is a huge disappointment for anyone with friends on different consoles or PC.
Huge.
And the lack of any meaningful in-game voice or text chat, it means if you do manage to matchmake with randoms, coordination is incredibly limited. It's mostly just pings, apparently.
Right. People felt they were forced immediately onto Discord or other external apps just to communicate effectively, which is kind of rough for a multiplayer-first game.
It really is.
Some sources speculated this might stem from potentially reusing the base Elden Ring engine, which also lacks these features. Maybe it was a cost-saving thing.
Could be.
But for a game explicitly built around mandatory multiplayer, these omissions, according to the feedback, they feel pretty significant.
Yeah, they really stand out. Another big sticking point reported was the strict requirement for 3 players, or solo play, but absolutely no option for 2 players.
Right. The duo issue.
So if you wanted to run this with just one friend or, your spouse, you're just out of luck.
Which seems like such a common use case.
It does. And while some comments speculated FromSoft might have omitted duos for, I don't know, balance reasons, the player sentiment seems to be that it feels like an easy, almost obvious mode they just chose not to include. Maybe thinking enemy health could have been adjusted or something.
Yeah, it felt like a missed opportunity to a lot of people in those discussions. Beyond the multiplayer structure itself, the community impressions also touch on the gameplay loop. A frequent comment was that it gets repetitive quite quickly.
Really?
Yeah, reviews noted the randomization isn't particularly deep. You see limited boss pools, repeated enemy layouts, and similar-looking structures. After even, say, 15, 20 hours, many felt they'd pretty much seen most of the variety. The potential variability per run just wasn't high enough.
Especially compared to other successful roguelikes, maybe.
Exactly. Like Hades or Balatro were mentioned as comparisons where the runs feel much more distinct each time.
It sounds like players felt they were effectively just running slightly remixed versions of the early areas of the base game, just over and over again.
Pretty much. And the sources indicated the solo experience felt particularly poorly balanced.
Oh, interesting.
While your damage apparently goes up, the encounters are fundamentally designed for 3 people. So fights just become longer, resource management gets much harder, especially under the run's sort of implicit time pressure.
That makes sense. There was also some debate around its review scores, right? They seem to land in the high 70s or low 80s on aggregation sites.
Yeah, that caused a bit of a stir. Some users felt these scores were maybe elevated by the Elden Ring brand.
Right, the FromSoft Halo effect.
Exactly. Suggesting it might score lower if it came from some unknown studio, especially given those multiplayer feature gaps and the repetitiveness we talked about.
But others push back on that.
They did, arguing that scores in the 70s and 80s aren't grim at all. They represent a good, albeit maybe flawed, game. And that this constant player expectation for 9s and 10s is just unrealistic.
That's a fair point, too. Regardless, a strong consensus from the sources seemed to be that Nightreign is an easy skip if you don't have that consistent group of 3 ready to go.
Definitely.
Or if your main enjoyment of Elden Ring comes from its vast exploration, which Nightreign just doesn't offer.
Right. The insight here seems to be that FromSoft's signature design philosophy, which often prioritizes very intentional, sometimes restrictive player interactions in their single-player or invasion systems, it fundamentally clashed with the logistical realities and feature expectations players have for a modern, dedicated multiplayer-first title.
A real mismatch there, it sounds like. Okay, let's shift gears dramatically. From that specific multiplayer experiment to what everyone was really waiting for, the Erd Tree in the room. Shadow of the Erd Tree.
Haha, yeah. The main event.
This is the highly anticipated traditional DLC, and the sources portray something just enormous, while still managing to ignite some really intense debate.
Absolutely. If there's one undeniable takeaway from the sources, it's the sheer scale of Shadow of the Erd Tree. It's described repeatedly as having just substantial new content.
Like how substantial?
Well, the Fextra Life Wiki, for example, lists an enormous number of new locations, everything from wide-open plains and swamps to treacherous mountains, dark forests, including numerous main and minor legacy dungeons.
Okay, hang on. What are legacy dungeons exactly in the Elden Ring context?
Good question. So, in Elden Ring, a legacy dungeon is one of those large, sprawling, multi-layered, interconnected environments. Think like Stormveil Castle or the Academy of Rey Lucaria from the base game.
Gotcha. The big complex levels.
Exactly. They're basically massive, handcrafted labyrinthine levels, distinct from the smaller caves or catacombs you find. And Erdtree apparently has several significant new ones.
Wow, okay. And the amount of items? The sources were just overflowing with details. Lists upon lists of new weapons across so many categories.
Oh, yeah.
Including 8 entirely new weapon types, like quick backhand blades, heavier great katanas, barehanded hand-to-hand arts, even less conventional stuff like perfume bottles used offensively, and specialized thrusting shields.
That's a lot.
Plus, tons of new armor sets, spells, incantations, spirit ashes, talismans, and new craftable items via new cookbooks. It feels truly massive.
And spirit ashes are those spectral allies you can summon to help you in combat, right?
Yeah, the summons.
The sources really emphasized how many new ones there are. It truly is a staggering amount of content for a DLC. Some players were comparing its size and scope to a full game like the original Bloodborne. Though, they also noted that maybe not all the bosses might be on the same legendary level as Bloodborne's most memorable ones. Joking a bit about the possibility of boss repeats or reskins cropping up here and there.
Okay, fair enough. There are also interesting new mechanics introduced specifically for the DLC area, like the Scadutree fragments and revered spirit ashes. What did the sources say about how those work?
Right, so the sources explained these are new collectible items you find scattered around the Realm of Shadow, the DLC area. When you use them at a site of grace, they give you localized buffs, they call them blessings.
Okay.
These increase your damage dealt and decrease damage taken, and they also boost the power of your spirit ashes and your mount, Torrent. But crucially, these blessings only work within the DLC zone.
Ah, so Torrent is your spectral steed for getting around the open world. Makes sense. And this blessing system, this became a point of debate regarding replayability, didn't it?
It did, yeah. While collecting them is technically optional, many players felt the challenging content pretty much necessitates gathering these buffs to make things manageable.
Right, you kind of need them.
Kind of, yeah. And some sources reported that having to recollect all these fragments and ashes on repeat playthroughs, like in New Game Plus, it started to feel like a chore rather than an enjoyable part of the exploration the second or third time around.
I could see that.
Potentially impacting the game's long-term replay value for some players anyway.
Okay. Diving into the lore, then, the sources say that DLC goes incredibly deep here.
Oh, yeah.
It focuses heavily on Miquella, one of the Empyreans from the base game story. This new figure, Mesmer the Impaler, who's a major player, and the hidden history of the realm of Shadow itself. Sources talked about exploring the origins of various curses, factions, even outer gods, giving backstory to Queen Marika, shedding light on entities like the Two Fingers.
Recontextualizing things from the base game, like grafting or the Mogwin dynasty. There's a lot there.
Definitely sounds like it. However, there's a but coming, isn't there?
There is. There's a pretty vocal group of players in the sources who felt the DLC's extensive lore, while deep, didn't connect enough to the base game's overarching narrative.
Oh, interesting. How so?
They argued it felt somewhat separate, like a side story, or even controversially, some called it like fan fiction, lacking sufficient foreshadowing in the base game, maybe.
Yeah.
They expected more direct answers to existing mysteries, like the identity or fate of the Glomite Queen, for instance.
Right. But others countered that.
Oh, yeah. Others countered, saying that the DLC does answer significant questions and ties into the base game. If you take the time to find all the environmental clues and item descriptions, the classic FromSoft lore delivery.
Usual cryptic approach.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They pointed to explanations for things like the origins of the Omen Curse or deeper insights into Maripa's motivations, suggesting the connection is there, just delivered subtly.
Okay, so a classic FromSoft lore debate then.
Pretty much. Which brings us to perhaps the most debated aspect revealed by the sources, the difficulty, and specifically the boss design.
Yes, the difficulty. Always a hot topic with FromSoft.
And the opinions here were incredibly polarized, just starkly different, ranging from players saying it's peak FromSoft, they cooked up some incredible challenges, to others calling it perceived artificial difficulty, and even some of the worst DLC boss design in the series.
Wow, that's a stark contrast indeed.
Yeah.
What specifically were the complaints centered on?
A lot of complaints focused on enemies and bosses hitting way too hard and too fast.
Okay.
Players reported being like two-shotted or immediately stun-locked by enemy combos, even with very high vigor, that's your health stat.
Right.
And wearing good defensive gear. They also mention high poise on enemies, that's their resistance to being staggered or interrupted.
Meaning they just attack right through your hits?
Yeah, enemies would just power through your attacks and hit you anyway, which felt frustrating to many.
I bet. Any specific bosses mentioned?
Oh yeah. Specific bosses drew particular fire according to the sources. Things like the divine beast dancing lion having camera issues.
Ugh, camera bosses.
Right. Rolana for relentless hard-to-punish combo spam. The Scattertree avatar for messy or lingering hitboxes.
What does lingering hitbox mean exactly?
It means the area where an attack can actually hurt you seems to stay active longer than the animation suggests, or it covers an unreasonably large area around the attack.
Ah, okay. That sounds annoying.
It can be. Also, Commander Gaius for high damage charges that felt hard to avoid and punish, and even the final boss, promised Consort Radon, was criticized by some for having a frustratingly short stagger window compared to his base game counterpart.
Any other mechanics people disliked?
Yeah, players described other things that felt unfair or frustrating, especially for melee builds. Things like input reading that punishes healing.
Input reading?
Meaning the game seemed to detect when you press the button to use a healing flask and would immediately trigger a boss attack specifically designed to hit you during that vulnerable animation.
Oof, that doesn't sound great.
No. People felt these elements, along with maybe delayed attacks or mechanics that required near-perfect execution, made encounters feel overly punishing. Or required very specific builds to overcome reliably, at least without relying heavily on those optional Scattertree blessings we mentioned.
Right.
Some felt this felt a bit out of character for FromSoft's usual fair but difficult design. Some sources even speculated maybe it was due to less polish or perhaps the main team being focused on their next big project.
But on the other side of that coin?
Exactly. On the other side, many veteran players and reviewers in the sources absolutely loved this level of difficulty.
Really?
Yeah, they felt it was exactly the amplified challenge they wanted. Describing these fights as some of the best and most engaging in the series, where the game finally felt interesting again or truly tested their skills after mastering the base game.
So the classic get good argument came up.
Pretty much. They argued players just needed to get good, learn the timings better, explore to find and actually utilize the new Scattertree blessing system, which is designed to help tune the difficulty.
Right. use the tools provided.
Or just adapt their strategy instead of relying solely on base game habits or builds that might not work as well against the new threats.
It really highlights that classic FromSoft tension, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. It's a significantly amplified challenge, no doubt. And while one segment of the fan base felt it crossed a line into being frustrating or perceived as unfair due to specific design choices like input reading or maybe aggressive hitboxes, another segment felt it was the perfect evolution of their challenging formula, exactly what they signed up for.
So, looking back at everything from the sources, Nightreign, Shadow of the Erdtree, what does this deep dive really reveal?
Well, I think what it really reveals, looking across both as presented in the sources, is just how complex the reception for even highly anticipated releases can be, especially from a developer like From Software with such a strong legacy and, very specific design philosophies. Nightreign's struggle, it really highlights how player logistics, like just simply having two friends available at the same time and evolving expectations for things like modern multiplayer features.
Cosplay chat.
Right. How those can sometimes clash directly with a developer's very specific design vision, especially for maybe a more experimental title.
Absolutely. And Shadow of the Erdtree, I mean, despite its immense scale, that incredible amount of content, and the deep lore expansion reported in the sources, it still shows how pushing the boundaries of difficulty way up, and incorporating new area-specific mechanics like the blessings can deeply polarize a really passionate fan base. It highlights that tension between delivering an incredibly challenging experience that veterans crave and ensuring it still feels fair, rewarding, and integrated well into the existing world for maybe a wider audience.
Exactly. Both releases, in their own distinct ways, sparked incredibly intense discussion, praise, and criticism drawn directly from the experiences players shared in the sources we looked at. It's fascinating.
It really is.
And it leaves us, and you listening, with something pretty significant to consider based on all this feedback. How much do our own personal circumstances, whether we happen to have the specific number of friends required for a game mode, our prior gaming history with the series, or our preferred play style, how much does that fundamentally predetermine our enjoyment of a new entry?
That's a great point.
And how much of a game's reception is truly about some kind of objective quality versus just the subjective fit for individual players and the really complex task of managing the sometimes conflicting desires within a passionate community?
Which raises, I think, an important final question for you to ponder. When we see such polarized reactions, like with Erdtree's difficulty or Nightreign's structure, how much does brand loyalty or just our pre-existing love for a series like Elden Ring really factor into how we judge a new release's actual merit, its flaws and all?
Compared to how we might evaluate it if it came from a completely unknown developer, maybe.
Exactly. Something to think about.